While I prefer to paint from life, sometimes it's just not possible. Maybe I'm painting a pet or a fidgety child, and it's hard enough to get a single good photograph, let alone a pose that they could hold long enough for a painting. So, for those of you who want to work from photos for whatever the reason, here are my tips for creating beautiful, convincing portraits from photos. I like to begin with a good photograph. So, for me, this usually means busting out my DSLR or mirrorless camera instead of my iPhone. It just winds up looking nicer and it gives me a lot more leeway to crop and edit the photo without sacrificing quality. The exact camera doesn't really matter though, and the lens isn't especially important. But in case it helps, I've used 35mm and 50mm lenses for my portraits, which are typically recommended as far as flattering a subject's face. I will also make one other note about cameras here. It's not 100% necessary or even overwhelmingly necessary, but a camera with great autofocus helps me a great deal with children and animals. I don't believe that it's critical, just helpful. So I recently upgraded my camera since portrait commissions are how I make my living, and having a great autofocus is a huge help. But again, I just wanted to put this out there in case you happen to be deciding between two cameras. But if you already have a DSLR or mirrorless camera that you really like, that's going to do a great job. Now, with the camera out of the way, I want to focus on lighting your subject and creating interesting color. I tend to rely on natural light or a softbox with a 5500 Kelvin bulb, which simulates natural daylight. I'll link the softbox I use in the description in case you're curious. It's very inexpensive, it does a great job, and I got it off Amazon, so it was really easy to get. And I just use one light, just like if I were going to paint right there from life. I don't rely on anything fancy beyond what you would see in any typical life drawing setup. And it's certainly not anything like you would see in a photography studio. The angle of my light is usually overhead, kind of at like a 3/4 angle, but there's really no rule here. So I would encourage you to just play around with your light source and the angle of your subject to it and just see what looks flattering. I tend to look for lighting setups that really make clear the form of the subject's face. So I don't want it totally flat like you might see in fine art photography. Instead, I want to light it in a way that lends itself to a good painting. So I want to be able to see interesting shadows across their face. I want to understand the form of their face and the anatomical structure. So that might just be one more thing to keep in mind. This is also one reason why I like to take my own photographs. What makes a really great photo portrait usually has nothing to do with what makes a good painted portrait. So I find that a lot of photographs that are taken just for the sake of being a photograph look really flat and the shadows are really soft and you lose that sense of form of the face, and I think it can make it much harder to paint. So this is just one more thing to keep in mind, but of course, light your subject the way that you want to light them and the way that you feel inspired. This leads me to my next point, which is to take a lot of photos from a lot of angles. Slight adjustments from your model from second to second can have a really big impact, and shifting the pose or the angle of the camera can lead to surprisingly good images. I usually stop taking photos when I have multiple in focus, beautiful shots at 3 or 4 different angles or poses. Ideally, I leave the shoot knowing exactly which one I'm excited to paint, or even better, coming away with multiple images I'd love to paint. And I've taken enough shots for each individual pose that I get to feel pretty confident that one of them is in focus or that their eyes are like nice and open for each pose that I'm excited about. And one last note about planning your photograph. Even if you are not super concerned with painting the background that was there for your photo shoot, it's helpful to plan a background based on shapes that were actually there for the photo. So even if you want a background kind of like you see here in this painting, which is very gestural and abstract, I still took my time and integrated those colors and integrated those shapes when I took the photo that I'm painting from. Specifically, I planned an abstract background based on shapes that were really there when I took the photo. I find that this helps you find interesting compositions that you might not have expected otherwise. So I staged the photo with red drapery behind my subject. This helped not only to bounce some red into his face and unify the colors that I knew would ultimately be in the painting, but it also gave me an opportunity to try different background shapes before I even began to paint. Now, with your photo taken, it's time to compose your painting. I know this might seem a little counterintuitive. After all, we composed the photo, didn't we? Ideally, this stage is not that involved, but usually it's just about making a few adjustments that make a big difference. To start, I always crop my photo to the exact size of my canvas. That means that when I play around with my composition, I know for a fact that it will work just as well in the painting because all of the proportions will be the same. Then, with the cropping complete, I plan my background. I remove any objects I don't like. I play around with adding abstract brush marks or shapes. And for this part, I use Photoshop, but if you're not comfortable using a program like this, you can always create thumbnails instead, whether they're in oil or something like gouache, to experiment with these more drastic background changes. Once you're done with this, your photo should look pretty much exactly the way you want the painting to look, although perhaps a little on the tighter side. If it doesn't, you would go ahead and continue to adjust your composition via thumbnails or in Photoshop until you're satisfied and you're ready to dive in. And if you are concerned about your photo looking too tight, I find it can be helpful to apply a blur in Photoshop so I don't get suckered into all of those teeny details and hard edges. One last note. I like to have my image displayed on a screen, whether it's my laptop or an iPad. I prefer both of those to printing my reference out. Printing means one more layer of distortion that I really want to avoid. It's already bad enough that I had to lose so much color by taking a picture rather than painting from life. I don't want the added color distortion that a printer inevitably factors into the mix. And on my screen, I make sure that my brightness level is appropriate and I don't have anything like night shift turned on that can distort my colors. And now we're ready to paint. As you saw at the beginning of this video, I usually wash in the lightest version of my background to start. So in this case, I wanted a red background over an ochre color, so I start with that wash of yellow ochre. Then I grab a darker color thinned with a little bit less Gamsol so it won't run, and I block in the anatomical landmarks. This means the overall silhouette and then massing in shadow shapes for the eye sockets, the shadow under the nose, the shadows under the lips, and the shadows under the jaw. From here, I'll often block in the largest average shapes of color I can see, so I might mix one flesh tone for the light parts of his face and another color mix for the shadows. And after I apply this to the entirety of the subject, I can begin whittling down these shapes, adding more nuance in terms of value and color shifts. Because this part doesn't have much to do with the photography side of things and painting from a photo, if you'd like to hear more about this process, I'm going to link to another portrait painting video in the upper right-hand corner where you can learn more about this full process start to finish. Once you are wrapping up your piece, though, you may find that your painting feels complete even while your photo still has a blur filter on it. I usually find this to be actually pretty helpful, and I'm continually seeking out edges that I can soften and brushwork I can simplify. So don't worry if you feel like you're done, even though your reference isn't in focus. For me, my challenge is to paint more loosely, which can be, well, a real challenge when painting from photos. So if this is you, check out my most recent video on creating more expressive brushwork, which I'm linking in the upper right-hand corner right now. And those are the exact steps I follow to paint from photos. If you learned something new today or you found this video helpful, please give it a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new videos. Until next time, please stay safe, take care of yourself, and I wish you very happy painting.